You are about halfway through your 205 journey now. Okay, so before we get started, I know you've gone through a number of these common lectures. I just want to talk for a minute about why we actually do this activity called a common lecture, and I want to start with a video clip. So we'll start here, and then we'll get going.
This is it. This is what matters. The experience of a product. How will it make someone feel? Will it make life better? Does it deserve to exist? You may rarely look at it, but you'll always feel it. This is our signature, and it means everything.
All right, so I wanted to start with that because this is what we're told these days, right? This is it. Most of you have probably seen one of these before, probably have one in your hand right now, right? This little device has changed our experience of so many different things, okay? And this ad is telling us this is what really matters, right? This is what it's all about, okay? And this is how most of our information is accessed nowadays, right? So we have Google if we want to Google something, or Twitter if we want news, or WhatsApp to connect with our friends, text, Facebooks, whatever. And this information beeps and vibrates and interrupts our lives regularly. And much of the information that we get here is trying to entertain us, right? And most of the information we get here is abbreviated, right? And so one of the reasons why we have this exercise of common lectures is to help you to develop the skill of listening. This skill that we want you to kind of focus on here is the ability to focus, to working to understand something that's not primarily trying to entertain you or trying to interest you. We might not find it interesting. But whether or not you realize it, this skill, this ability to focus and try to listen and learn is an important and valuable life skill. And so we try to take you through this to help you to develop that skill. And I want to encourage you not to buy into what this ad is saying. Okay, this is not it. There's more to life than just how you feel in the immediate experience. And so I want to ask for khidmeh zghira, if you can. I'm sure most of your devices here have an off switch. I don't know if you've ever used that before, but you could try to turn it off or at least put the volume down. And I want you to try to join me here the next 45 minutes and try to work on focused listening, okay? Today we're going to be looking at Christian thought in late antiquity as a background to help you better understand our reading of Augustine's Confessions. And I realize that most of us, if you're where we are in our class, you're still discussing Plato. So this lecture might feel a little premature, but hopefully we can build from Plato and then explore the religious and philosophical background that you will encounter when you come to Confessions. So I want to start by asking a question. Have you ever felt misunderstood, right? My mother, Bikil Ihtiram, is the type of woman likes to tell everyone about Beit Merrifield, Shuam Basir, in our family. And growing up, I can remember more than one time having a conversation with my mother and then hearing her on the phone, ma khalti, talking to khalti and telling her what we just discussed. And usually what happened was that as I was listening to my mother talk to my aunt, I realized that what I had tried to communicate to my mother was nothing at all like what she was communicating to my aunt. So I would say, yeah, mama, right, bikil ihtiram again. That's not what I said. So what was happening in that situation is my mother was interpreting what she had heard through her own experience, through her own way of seeing the world, and then creating something that had little to do with what me, as the communicator, had really meant to say. And this is very easy to do. And the remainder of 205, once you finish with Plato, you will be dealing with authors in the religious traditions of Christianity and Islam. Many of you are familiar, at least with some of these traditions, which means that we need to listen extra carefully in order not to put our own understandings and experiences onto the text. So, for example, when Augustine uses a term like sin or will or God, instead of putting our own ideas of God onto what Augustine is saying, we need to ask questions. Shu yani, shu azdu, right? What does he mean by this term? So let me give you a simple example. In our day, Catholic, when we use the term Catholic, it's a particular type of tradition in Christianity, led by the Pope, different than Orthodox or Protestant or other Christian traditions. But when we come to the term Catholic in Augustine's text, the term simply meant universal, okay, the universal church. And so this is a very simple example, but in fact a variety of Christian traditions still use and reference Augustine's works today, not just Catholicism. But this little example just shows how easy it is for us to take something from our own world and place it on the text and then end up misunderstanding. So we'll never be able to understand our text perfectly. We're separated by time and culture. But if we can learn to listen, if we can learn to try and understand from the author's point of view, and if we can learn a little bit about what was happening in the time and in the day and in the world when our authors wrote, then we can get a better understanding of what questions were being asked and what questions were trying to be answered. So what I'm trying to do is give you today some tools to help you as you try to listen to the text of Confessions to help you do that more effectively. So let me give you a little bit of a roadmap as to where we're going. I'm going to start by giving us a definition of late antiquity, which is the name given to the period when Augustine lived. Then I want to discuss a little bit about Neoplatonism, which we'll encounter in Augustine and is part of the philosophical background to the Confessions. Then we'll talk a little bit about the development of a specifically Christian identity and highlight some of the central questions that Christian thinkers were asking. Then we will look at the early church's attitudes towards philosophy and some of the challenges that the church was facing. And then we'll finish up by talking about some of the political changes in Augustine's time, and then ask ourselves, why Confessions? Why are we reading Confessions? Now, the division of the past into these specific periods of time, like late antiquity, is not a part of history. These are classifications that we bring to history. They help us understand what was going on. And this can be controversial because history, like most of our lives, is very complex, right? You can define a period by changes in culture, by changes in society or politics or philosophy or religion, and the lives of those who lived before us, just like ours, are this ebb and flow of all these different elements. Now, traditionally, late antiquity is understood to represent the period of time from the rule of the Roman Emperor Diocletian in 284 up until the time of the Arab conquests between 634 and 750. Now, this was a time of transition from a Roman Empire based on the cultural history of the ancient Greek and Roman civilizations, which we've been introduced somewhat to the ancient Greek civilization. And this is called the Greco-Roman world. And so it's this period of time between the Greco-Roman world and the establishment of the Byzantine Empire, or the Middle Ages or medieval period, which was based upon the monotheism of Christianity. So stories like the Odyssey or Oedipus, the King, the play, or philosophies like the philosophy of Plato are all products of the Greco-Roman world. And Greco-Roman society was built upon polytheistic myths, as we've seen, and incorporated a variety of polytheistic cult types of practices. Now, whether or not we want to say that gods are understood as symbols or realities, the fabric of the society and the social order was based on this pluralistic, polytheistic foundation, where in general terms we could say that the cosmos were understood as a sort of impersonal principle or cosmic divine order. Now, in contrast to the polytheistic foundations of the Greco-Roman world, the Middle Ages or medieval period represents a society built upon, as I said, the monotheism of Christianity, with its claim that God, in his perfection, entered into the world in the incarnation of Jesus, God the Son, who died for humanity, which was a symbol of God's ultimate and personal act of love. So Christianity as the state religion in the medieval period was more than simply a personal religious expression. It was the foundation of the society, what the social structures were built upon, what the politics of life were built upon, architecture, social norms, advancement opportunities were all in some way connected to the Christian faith. Intellectually, the Middle Ages represents a time dominated by a state-enforced set of Christian beliefs. So it was in this period of political and religious transition from a society built upon Greco-Roman tradition to an empire established upon a state-enforced Christianity, which we call late antiquity. And it's in this period that St. Augustine is born to a pagan father and to a Christian mother. And so we could see, even in this diversity within his own family, it's a sort of reflection of the times. And you could even possibly say that his father's deathbed to conversion to Christianity, in some sense, reflects the general direction of a society as moving away from Roman polytheism towards various expressions of Christianity. Now, I want to take a quick step back and talk a little bit about the philosophical background of the Confessions. By now, you should be discovering the philosophy of Plato, the world of forms, the difference between knowledge and opinion, talking about the simile of the cave, or you'll get into that. And as we begin to read from thinkers in the monotheistic traditions of Christianity and Islam, many of the philosophical concepts that we encounter in Plato are important, since our religious thinkers and authors were trying to understand this relationship between philosophy and religious expression. Now, about 100 years before the birth of Augustine, a Roman philosopher by the name of Plotinus attempted to bring together or reconcile the philosophy of Plato, the philosophies of Plato and his student Aristotle. Now, Plotinus was working within a larger philosophical context where thinkers had been discussing this relationship for a long time, but he gave expression to a mystical expression of Platonism, which Plotinus articulated, and it became known later as Neoplatonism. And in the Confessions, when Augustine talks about reading the books of the Platonists, which you'll read, he is talking about the philosophy of Neoplatonism. So it's important for us to at least have a beginning understanding of what this means. So Plotinus took Plato's concept of the form of the good and developed it into an idea that he called the One. Now, in Plotinus's writings, the One is the source of all things, the giver of our being or existence, gives being and existence to everything in creation. And Plotinus gives a definition of perfection of the One as seeking nothing, possessing nothing, lacking nothing. Okay. He then, from this, presents a vision of ultimate reality where everything that exists is a result of overflow, which he calls emanation from the One. And so the basic principle of this emanation, you see this overflow from the One to the intellect to the world soul, down all the way to the physical universe. The basic principle of emanation is that it's necessary that the less perfect come as a result of the overflow from the more perfect. Now, Neoplatonic philosophers argued that the first thing that overflows from the One is the nous, or the universal intellect. And this is where they place Plato's world of forms that we interact with. Okay? And now this intellect is beyond time, does not move, understands all things in an eternal present. And then after the intellect, then there's another overflow, and then comes the world soul. And this is where Neoplatonic thinkers place the beginning of motion and argue that it was through motion that everything in the material world is therefore created. Now, Plotinus focused on this triad, the One, the intellect, and the world soul, which are all in some sense perfect, and distinguished them from the imperfect, corruptible material world which we live in. Okay. Now, according to Plotinus, the process of gaining knowledge is working back towards the source of our existence, back towards the One. Now, as we've hopefully seen in Plato, philosophy was more than simply a theory about the cosmos. It's not simply a department pajama, right, where people over there think about things. Different philosophical expressions explored the question about the state of our humanity. What does it mean to be human? What are the means of human perfection? Philosophy claimed to teach how human conduct could be in harmony with the structures of all being and with the universe. Now, this is a very, very brief description of Neoplatonic thought, But I want to give this to you as a starting point for understanding some of this philosophical background Augustine encounters. And we can see how he is interacting with these Neoplatonic thinkers and seeing perfection and the world of corruption. Okay? Now, let's take a step forward from here, or actually a step back and then move forward. And we'll talk about the Roman Empire and then the expansion of Christianity. In 4 BCE, the Jesus Jewish of Nazareth was born in Bethlehem in Judea, over here in the far eastern corner of the Roman Empire. And then at the age of 30, he began teaching in the cities of Judea. He developed a group of Jewish followers called disciples who believed that he was the Messiah, or anointed one, who God had sent to establish a new covenant, a new relationship with Israel, as promised by the Jewish books of prophecy. Now, Jesus was very critical of the Jewish religious institutions and traditions and the religious leaders. And as often is the case in such situations, he was killed by the Romans under the instigation of the Jews in around 29 CE, 3 years after he started teaching. Now, after Jesus' death, the kerygma, or the message that Jesus' disciples taught, was centered on explaining the death of Jesus as a sacrifice offered to God as an atonement or payment for sin. Jesus' followers taught that it was only through this sacrifice of Jesus that God's broken relationship with humanity could be restored. There was a focus on the resurrection of Jesus as a symbol of God's victory over sin, as God's victory over death. And this concept of atonement is very important, this concept of payment for sin. And this idea of payment for sin or atonement through sacrifice would have been very familiar to a Judaism that was based on a sacrificial system centered on the temple in Jerusalem. And even today, Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement, is considered the holiest day of the year in Judaism, and it's a time of purification and cleansing from sins. Now, it was in the context of the Jewish sacrificial system that Jesus' death as sacrifice for sin was understood as God's ultimate act of love. Now, these Jewish followers of Jesus, they didn't think they were starting a new religion. And I imagine if we were to go back in time and be a part of there, they would seem to be one of many sects of Judaism that were present. We had Sadducees, Pharisees, Essenes, Zealots, Qumran sect. Okay? The group was actually first called Christians in the city of Antioch, a name that was most likely given to them by their opponents, not adopted by them themselves. And they were called Christians simply because they considered Jesus the Christ, which is the Greek term, Christos is the Greek term for Messiah, which, as I said, means anointed one. Now, one of the most significant events to shape the development of Christian thought is recorded in the New Testament book of Acts and is claimed to have taken place around 50 CE. Now, this event came to be known in later Christian tradition as the Council of Jerusalem. And as I have mentioned, the original followers of Jesus, they were Jews. But they also taught that the message of Jesus was for all people, a universal message. Now, as non-Jews began to believe this message, the question raised was, do you have to follow Jewish ceremonial law in order to follow the teachings of Jesus? And so the issues raised at the time were, first of all, non-Jews, Romans, Greeks, as I've talked about, they ate food deemed unclean by the Jewish law, pigs and such. And so the question was, did these non-Jews have to follow Jewish food regulations? That was the first question, if they wanted to follow the teachings of Jesus. The second question was, a central part of the religious tradition was that Jews practiced circumcision. Now, if you don't know what circumcision is, don't Google it. Just ask someone, I'd prefer. But the Jews practiced circumcision, and non-Jews were uncircumcised. Okay? So the question was, do non-Jews have to be circumcised to follow the teachings of Jesus? Now, the council's decision, taken in around 50 CE, as to whether non-Jews had to follow these Jewish ceremonial law was no. It was determined that the message of Jesus was not one of external law, such as eating or not eating certain foods, but of an internal change and morality. And so this elimination of the requirements of the Jewish law had very significant implications. For the Jewish followers of Jesus, within a few hundred years, they found themselves rejected and disconnected from their own Jewish culture, as well as misunderstood by the growing number of non-Jewish or Gentile followers of Jesus, who now saw no need for the Jewish law. Now, by the time of Augustine, when we get to Augustine, the overwhelming majority of Christians are therefore non-Jews. So this also laid the idea of the foundation for the authority of a council, which then later becomes a part of the Christian tradition. This is the idea that the leaders of the larger Christian tradition gather and make decisions on questions of importance in the church. But the philosophical ramifications, which I want to focus on, of this decision were that it sort of opened the door for trying to define and understand Christian notions and the significance of Jesus and his message outside of a Jewish framework. So the message of Jesus was no longer tied exclusively to a particular cultural or religious heritage. And this allowed the ideas of Christianity to interact and mingle with the philosophies of the day outside of a clearly defined religious structure, which, as we will see, led to a rise of a variety of philosophies that all made some claim to be Christian. Now, as Christianity spread, the questions that defined the development of Christian thought were questions of, who was Jesus? This is called a question of Christology. So early Christian thinkers wrestled with what is meant by the idea that Jesus was God incarnate, and God in flesh, and that God in Jesus enters into time and enters into the corruptible world. They also wanted to know, if Jesus died and rose again, what does it mean that Jesus is God? This is a question about the nature of his divinity. And then how is the human Jesus related to the divinity, and why did he need to be God? For instance, Augustine was instrumental in responding to what became known as the Arian heresy. This was when a bishop named Arius claimed that Jesus was created and not eternal. Now, unlike the gods of Greco-Roman polytheism, the Christian Godhead was understood to be perfect. And as we've seen in the work of Plato, philosophical perfection carries with it this idea of an unchanging or non-physical reality. So in Christian thought, the philosophical question that was raised was, how can a perfect God express or incarnate himself in the material world and in all things human flesh? Okay. This is also a question of God's relationship to the nearness to the world, which is known as immanence, and difference or otherness from the world, which is called transcendence. Now, as I've already mentioned, Neoplatonic philosophers are building on Plotinus and arguing that the world came to be through the emanation of the One, that the movement of the celestial spheres brings together form and matter to produce something particular like you and me. But this emanation was, in some sense, impersonal. So religious thinkers like Augustine, they had to wrestle with this question. How do you portray a God that seemingly interacts with the world, that cares about humanity, and how do you reconcile that with the philosophical idea of perfection or otherness of God that seems to remove him from humanity? Now, a second question was, what was the significance, again, of the death and resurrection of Jesus? This is a question of atonement. You can Google that if you want. How was the church to understand this idea of sacrifice? Why did Jesus have to die and be raised again? This is a question about the state of humanity. What about our condition requires such a sacrifice? Why is mankind in need of a redeemer or a redemption? This is a question about the means of human perfection. What is it about the sacrifice of Jesus that helps move us towards perfection? Right. Now, near the end of his life, Augustine also wrote prolifically against what became known as the Pelagian heresy. Now, this was a British monk named Pelagius who argued that the idea of original human corruption, what later became to be known as original sin, was not a part of our humanity. And so Augustine writes against that and defends the idea of original human corruption. It becomes known as original sin. Now, a third question raised was the question of what do these claims mean for how one understands the world. This is a question of the relationship between faith and reason. And as you read the Confessions, if you listen well, you'll see that all these questions are questions that Augustine explores. Okay, so take a minute now. Everyone, move your head around, stretch. Okay, we got to focus in. If that helps, don't talk. Okay, just a minute. Focus in here. We're going to push through. And we're going to move forward and talk a little bit about Christian thought from Jesus to Constantine. Okay. Now, in the first 150 years after the death of Jesus, the expansion of Christianity went largely unnoticed. But by 200 CE, you had thinkers like Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Clement, Origen, Tertullian, and they had begun to establish a reputation within the intellectual circles of the Roman Empire. Now, as we've mentioned, Christianity was largely concerned with ethics, or how we live, and so it had this inevitable encounter with philosophy. Now, Justin Martyr, who lived between 100 and 165 and came from Palestine, just south of us, is said to have studied with teachers in the different philosophical schools of Stoicism, Aristotelianism, Pythagoreanism, Platonism. So he had studied all of these philosophies, and then as an adult, after these studies, he converted to Christianity. Then Justin argued that he believed that the truths that are partially understood or apprehended in philosophy find their fulfillment or correction in the framework of Christian faith. So according to Justin, Plato's understanding of the divine creation, even Plato's description of the divine triad, could be traced to Plato reading the books of Moses on his visit to Egypt. So Justin saw Christianity as kind of the final piece of the philosophical puzzle, the philosophical search for understanding, a sort of faith completing reason. So philosophy or reason can provide most of what you need, but reason is missing some key pieces only found in Christian faith. Now, in contrast, Tertullian, who lived 160 to 225, represents a far different approach. So in discussing philosophy, Tertullian wrote, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" And when he said that, he means, what does philosophy have to do with faith? And so this question of faith and philosophy was part of a larger argument of those who claimed to be Christian, but in truth did not accept the authority of Scripture or revealed religion, but instead only relied on their own powers of reason. So for Tertullian, the divine character of Christianity was shown to be true not in its reasonableness, but by the very fact that it's the kind of thing that no ordinary mind could have invented. So he discussed the crucifying of the Son of God and says, this sounds ridiculous. It's scandalous. And so he wrote, I believe because it's outrageous. So Tertullian urged reliance on faith in the matters of exploring the primary truths explored in philosophy and religious understanding. In Tertullian, we see that faith and philosophy, or faith and reason, are two separate approaches to understanding reality. Now, Tertullian was not simple-minded, a very prolific thinker and writer. He coined the term Trinity to express the relationship between the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He talked about an inherent flaw in the human soul, which you'll see in Confessions. Okay. Now, a third author, Origen, lived between 184 and 254, and he wrestled, again, with this question: how do you present a philosophical picture of a Neoplatonic conception of the divine, a God free from passion, a God free from change, and at the same time talk about a God who suffers from the sinful way of his children, and because of his love descends to their level in revelation and in incarnation. And so, again, the philosophical tension he faced is trying to combine a God beyond human emotions with the concept of a God who's personal and caring for humanity. And this demonstrated in the mission of God's image, Jesus Christ. Now, Origen used the Platonic division of the cosmos into matter, soul, and mind to interpret the Bible. And he taught that Scripture has three levels of meaning, according to these. So you have a literal historical sense, you have a moral meaning, and then you have a spiritual interpretation. And he argued that when you get to a text where it seems that the literal sense is absurd, that it must have been placed there as a signpost to look for spiritual allegorical interpretation. And so when we get to Ibn Rushd, we'll see a similar argument being made by Ibn Rushd. But where should we place Augustine in this spectrum of thought? Now, you might talk about this in your sections, but I want to give a few thoughts by way of introduction. Augustine wrote, "I believe in order that I may understand." So much later, in the 11th century, St. Anselm described this approach as faith seeking understanding. So here, faith is not the final piece of a puzzle assembled by reason, nor a set of beliefs that stand opposed to reason. The believer is charged to use reason not for attaining faith, but that he or she might be gladdened by understanding the things they already believe. Okay. And so this question about the relationship between philosophy and reason and religious belief is one that we'll continue to explore through the remaining of the semester. It's a central theme in our religious authors. And I want to point out, this is not something that was only relevant. Okay, this is still a very relevant question. To what extent does religious faith interact with philosophies like relativism or evolutionary theories or postmodernism, the philosophies of the day? This is still a very relevant question. Now, the philosophies may or may not change, but the questions remain the same. Now, Augustine, as you've probably seen so far, was not just a thinker, he was a Christian thinker. And some of the challenges he dealt with in his world dealt with this question of religious self-definition. What does it mean to be called a Christian? So on your fly sheet, I've put a couple of controversies the early Christian church dealt with in this process. I have the Marcion controversy on there, which is a question of whether or not the divine is a new picture of the divine. I have the Montanist controversy on your fly sheet. This is about whether or not there's further revelations. We're not going to talk about these, but you can look them up if you're interested. But what I want to discuss is Manichaeism, because we'll come across this in our text. And so in Confessions, we'll hear about this philosophy. And Mani, who is the founder of Manichaeism, this was grouped under what early Christian thinkers labeled Gnosticism. And this is, again, very difficult and controversial task since the term was used very broadly. But bilises, the term comes from the Greek term gnosis, which means knowledge. And Gnostic philosophies claim to have special or secret knowledge. So some of the claims of Gnosticism, consistent in Manichaeism, are this idea that you have secret traditions or knowledge that Jesus taught his disciples in private. So the founder of Manichaeism, Mani, considered himself an apostle of Jesus Christ, considered himself the promised Holy Spirit, the one that Jesus had promised would come. So similar to the Montanist controversy, a central question here is the nature of revelation. Is there continuing revelation, or is Jesus the final revelation? There's an emphasis on the dualism between matter and spirit, with matter being evil and spirit good. And so in Manichaeism, we see good and evil are independent, pre-existing phenomena. They're represented by the realm of light, the realm of darkness, and these two realities are in this ongoing battle. Now, what is claimed to be known, number 3, is a myth about the creation of the world. And so in Manichaeism, for instance, there was the idea that the God of light had to use a mixed substance of light and darkness to create the earth, and this is why there's evil in the world. And then most forms of Gnosticism dealt with this idea that there's a divine spark in humanity, fallen, that needs to be awakened by this secret knowledge, like some of you need to be awakened by this knowledge right now, right? So, this, again, it's a very brief description of Manichaeism, but I want to look at number 2 here, this idea of dualism, where good and evil represent these two independent, pre-existing realities, with matter as evil and the spirit as good. And this, again, is how Manichaeists began to try to understand, why is there evil in the world? Now, one of the central questions that we'll see in Augustine is, how can one understand or make sense of the existence of evil within a framework, a religious framework, that claims that evil is not eternal, that matter is not bad, and that the divine is all-powerful, perfect, and good? How can you bring these ideas together? Okay, the Manichaeists dealt with it. These Gnostic philosophies said, well, there's good and evil eternal. And so he has to deal with the fact that evil's not eternal. Then how do we understand this? So this Gnostic philosophies like Manichaeism challenged the message or the kerygma of the church. Now, in response to challenges like this, the local assemblies began to meet and address issues and try to present an agreed-upon message and represent a visible body. And so by the time of Augustine, it became necessary to establish a criteria, a standard for determining which letters and books that were being used should be accepted as containing the authentic kerygma or message of Jesus. So it's in 397, the Third Council of Carthage, which Augustine was a part of. Then an accepted list of church-approved books was adopted, and the New Testament, as is known today, was there adopted by those books at that time. Now, this decision to accept or reject religious writings that were already being used within the church is another important step for defining Christian self-definition. Okay, so hang on, we're almost done. So far, we have, right? We've defined late antiquity. We have discussed Neoplatonism as a philosophical background. We've highlighted some key questions that Christian thinkers were asking. We've looked at Christian attitudes towards philosophy and challenges to the church. And so we're going to wrap up by looking at the political changes in late antiquity and then ask ourselves, why confessions? Now, politically and socially, the 4th century was a century of radical change and confusion for the followers of the Christian faith. It began with an attempt to try to exterminate, to get rid of all Christians, and then ended with Christianity being adopted as the official religion of the Roman Empire. So how did that happen? In 303, the Roman Emperor Diocletian, who we've already mentioned, led this fierce empire-wide persecution of Christians, trying to eliminate them completely. Around 306, 3 years later, the Roman Emperor Constantine came to power in the Western Roman Empire. And then in 312, as Constantine is going to battle, he has a vision of a cross. He hears a voice that says, "In this sign you will conquer." He fights his battle, he wins, and after the battle converts to Christianity. A year later, in 313, he issues the Edict of Milan, which legalizes Christianity in agreement with the pagan emperor Licinius, that made Christianity now legal, not illegal. In 324, Constantine becomes the sole ruler of the Roman Empire, defeats Licinius. And then in 380, the two emperors of the eastern and western part of the Roman Empire decree that all subjects should adhere to the Catholic or universal Christian faith, and Christianity becomes the official state religion of the Roman Empire. So there's a major turn of events, 80 years, one lifetime, right? A major turn of events that takes place in this 80 years, from extinction to power. And so during this time, the conversion of Constantine brings official recognition, government support, involvement of Christianity in social life, but it also brings politics into the church, political interference from the side of emperors who enforced obedience to a particular set of beliefs. Now, it's in 354, 18 years after the death of Constantine, 26 years before the establishment of Christianity as the state religion of the Roman Empire, that Aurelius Augustinus, or Augustine, was born. Augustine came to faith at 31 years of age in 386 in the midst of this shifting landscape. And so his writings occur in this context of the church's increasing power and social significance as he tries to bring this faithful view of the people of Christ drawn out from the world with this reality that now Christianity is in the social position of power. Now, in his lifetime, he wrote 100 titles, over 200 letters, close to 400 sermons. As I've mentioned, he wrote in response to Arius, to Pelagius. He wrote against Manichaeist thought. He composed the great work, The City of God, where he attempts to articulate how to understand the church in this changing political concept landscape. And one of these writings was Confessions, which he wrote 10 years after his conversion, which we have here, which you should buy a copy of soon, right? Now, throughout this semester, you should ask yourselves and your professors, why this author? Why this text? Why Confessions? Of everything we could read, why this? Now, there's no question that Augustine's writings have had a major impact on the direction of both philosophy and Christian theology, but why? Why Augustine? By many, the Confessions is considered the first true autobiography. And as you begin to read Confessions, you'll see that it's more than just a philosophical or religious work. It's an expression of human reflection, a personal reflection of Augustine's search for truth. So Augustine doesn't simply talk about and try to make sense of the world around him. He tries to make sense of himself. And he uses his own life and experiences as a way to explore this question of what it means to be human. Now, one of the reasons that Confessions has remained such a powerful expression of human thought, one appreciated both by religious and non-religious thinkers, is that Augustine, he's not content to simply talk about good and evil in these abstract terms, but he asks about good and evil in himself. So let's talk about your experience right now. Some of you might be asking yourself, why is it that although it's intellectually it's a good thing to listen to this lecture, right? And even potentially useful on an exam sometime. Why can't you simply will yourself to concentrate? Why? Why can't you just will yourself to concentrate? Augustine wants to make sense of why is it that I do things that intellectually I don't want to do, and why is it that I feel powerless to do the things I intellectually want to do? So this battle that some of you are engaged in right now between listening to the lecture and fading off is a very human experience. It's a battle that some of your peers have lost, right? But the question is, how can we make sense of it? Now, in taking you along his life journey, Augustine is going to ask you to take a minute and ask yourself, why is it you spend so much time studying biology, business, engineering? Why do you spend so much time studying the physical world, the material world, yet never take a moment to try to understand yourself, your inner self? He's going to ask you, as you look at your watches or phones, right, how much time do we have left, right? He's going to ask you, think about how is it that our lives so dominated by the concept of time that we don't really even know what time is, right? And he's going to ask you to think about questions of faith and reason. And here, by faith, Augustine doesn't mean religious belief, but all knowledge that we accept on the authority of others. For instance, how do you know that your mother and father are actually your mother and father? It's a matter of faith, trusting what you've been told. We've seen in Oedipus the King, right? Our knowledge of such things is not always certain knowledge. It's a knowledge we accept on the authority of others. And as he discusses these questions of will, memory, time, and faith, he's going to be asking, what do these things reveal about himself and about our shared humanity? But I want to be careful here, because this lecture is about Christian thought in late antiquity, and I want to point out that the term Christian hopefully will not bias your reading of the work. The question that Augustine explores in Confessions are larger than his Christian context. He doesn't simply explain or defend doctrines in an attempt to convert. He expresses what his beliefs mean in life. We see in Augustine, whether we agree or disagree with his view of the world, that a way of life must be lived and experienced. And of course, woven within the Confessions, there is an argument, so we want to listen to the argument. He uses the events of his life to craft an argument for how he understands humanity and the nature of the world, and we want to try to understand that. Now, this background information is meant to help you better understand some of these issues that Augustine was facing, so you can have a richer experience of the text. But I want to say, we should approach this text like a meal. If you've been in my section, you've heard this already. But if you were to refuse to eat something because it wasn't cooked perfectly, right? Or if you refused to eat something because you knew you would have to get rid of it, you'd have to go to the hammam ba'din, right? Discard it, right? What would happen? You'd starve. In the same way, if we refuse to interact and digest what an author has to say because the author is Christian or Muslim or believes things that we know we reject, we end up intellectually starving ourselves. And we miss the opportunity to benefit from all the good things that the author has to share before we go and discard and determine what is of no use. So let me leave you with this. It was at the age of 19 that it was not a Christian thinker that first stirred the young Augustine and his heart. It was the Roman philosopher Cicero who wrote, Do not simply admire one or another school of philosophy, but love wisdom itself, whatever it might be, and search for it, pursue it, hold it, and embrace it firmly. And so it's my hope that many of you, whether Christian, Muslim, Druze, atheist, otherwise, that your encounter with the life of St. Augustine will push you forward and help you search for a richer experience in your own life. So take time to digest the Confessions. It's a meal worth savoring. Thank you. You're dismissed.